Hi, this is Paul. Some of you might have been noticing that I have been talking about Islam. And I've been going back and forth on Twitter a little bit with a few Muslims who watch the channel, and they've been very kind. They've obviously had critiques of some of what I've done. And so I wanted to give a little bit of fuller explanation and then dive into a few things. Now, my interest in Islam is not because I'm looking to convert. Sorry, hate to disappoint, but I disappoint those who are hoping that I'll convert to Orthodoxy. Uh, but no, and I'm not going to convert to Islam, and I'm not saying that those two things are the same either. Anyway, my interest in Islam is because it makes for a very interesting test case about some of the other questions that I have about secularism, its qualities, and the West, and the degree to which civilizational Christianity, or what it is and how it is. Because Islam, of course, grows out of Judaism and Christianity, it's sort of a helpful test case. And because of the very interesting history that Islam has had in the history of the world. Now, I very consciously, for the first 5-6 years of this podcast, avoided talking about Islam. And the reason I avoided talking about Islam is all of the issues that I'm getting into now, because I don't know a lot about it. I know enough about it to, read Houston Smith's The World Religions. I've read other summaries of Islam. So I've read small amounts, a few books on Islam, and so I have a cursory understanding of a few things. But a big part of what this channel is about is religion, and what on earth religion is, and how it interacts with our lives. And, so part of where I got into this is very telling with respect to my conversation with Jonathan Peugeot on this, because if you recall, I began talking to him about civilizational Christianity, because that's really easily where the issue of Islam comes to the fore. Now, the question of Islam is a much bigger question for the Christian nations of Western Europe, obviously. The UK, it's a very hot topic in the UK, and it's come up quite a bit there. And it's also interesting to me how Jordan Peterson continues to keep an eye out towards Islam, and I think that's because of a number of elements of Peterson that he wants to sort of bring these Abrahamic religions together. And so I think he's got, through, say, Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager, I think he has a sense that he's got some relationship with the Jews through Bishop Barron and Jonathan Peugeot. I think he's got some sense of relationship with the Christians. And then he tries reaching out to Islam, and everything gets weird very fast. Now, some of what people have said to me about how I've started some of those critiques, you could very well say to Peterson, well, if you're going to reach out to Islam, probably don't reach out to Muhammad Hijab. And a bunch of the people on Twitter would probably agree with me. But therein lies the question about religion and why I've been avoiding talking about Islam for a very long time. Now, Claire Kahn has been on the channel in some live streams. She came to one of our estuary meetups in London. She's actually in one of the audiences in this debating a reformation of Islam. And she pops up on Twitter sometimes, and she does what she does. But part of the difficulty of approaching something as massive as a world religion, as a major world religion like Islam, is it's sort of approaching a nation. Like, okay, I'm going to approach the UK. Well, how would I start? Where would I start? The difference being, however, that all my life I've bumped up into English things, and it's been deep in my culture. Now, if I decided I was going to try to get acquainted with China, and I don't mean the things that we drink tea out of, I mean the nation, the civilization, where do you begin? Because it's just such a massive thing. And now everybody's going to say, well, begin where I am. Well, I'm not where you are. And so I appreciate your help and your comments, and I'll certainly read them. Doesn't mean I'll agree with you. But, your input is welcome. And I think, again, that's part of the key thing that for me the creation of this little corner and estuary have done. Now there's a Muslim man in John Van Donk's estuary. I don't have any in my particular estuary, but this is part of the process and part of the package that you have to begin somewhere, and so then you start studying. For me, a good place to begin was Tom Holland. I had one go through of The Shadow of the Sword, not nearly well enough. I plan on doing another. I'm currently reading his The Forge of Christianity, which I'm finding tremendously helpful on the topic. Part of this is because if you go through a bunch of interviews that Tom Holland has done, when he kind of goes through how he came to write Dominion for our Millennium, which was the title of the book in the UK, and in the United States it's The Forge of Christendom, and then The Shadow of the Sword. I mean, this is all part of Tom Holland's journey, and for me, it's easier to follow someone's journey that I know to a degree. And so Tom Holland, for me, is a very accessible source. Now, again, you might... And it's very clear from some of these videos that a lot of people are extremely annoyed with Tom Holland because of what Tom Holland wrote in his book. But Tom Holland is he's a writer of secular popular history. And then some people will complain, well, he's not an academic. Oh, okay. But then you're going to have all those issues to deal with. Well, he's not a Muslim. Oh, okay. No, fair enough. Neither am I. But for me, Tom Holland is a great place to start because I've already got a fair amount of Tom Holland mapped. And so I don't both have to remap a new author and try to remap something as large as Islam as I go into this, especially because, again, my main interest in this is not political per se, what is happening in politics around the world, or Hamas, Israel, or none of that is my main concern. My main concern is very much closer to Tom Holland's main concern, which is Christianity, Christendom, and the way, for example, that Christianity relates to civilization. Not the computer game, which I very much enjoy, but civilization, the thing that we talk about with respect to that word. Now, and it's also helpful for me because in some ways I begin kind of with other areas that I know. And right away with many Muslims that want to talk to me about this, they want to begin with the Quran. And okay, I know some things about the Quran, and I know how you feel about translations of the Quran. And as someone made a point before, I forget who it was right now, but I'm sure it'll bubble up. Christianity begins in translation. The Septuagint is the Bible for the New Testament church. And so right away when you say, well, you have to learn Arabic to read the Quran, I'm going to say, that's probably never going to happen. You know, I hate to get your hopes up, but no. And if you say the only way to actually know the Quran, the only way to actually know Islam is to read it in Arabic, I'd say, you see what I mean about the fact that if you're sitting there on pins and needles hoping that I will convert, you're probably better spending your attention elsewhere because it's not going to happen. Because at least what I know about it, not terribly impressed. Now, a lot of other people mention David Wood, and that's fine. You know, if I would have a conversation with David Wood, that would be fine. I've watched some of his videos. I wouldn't say I'm familiar with his channel, but I know where his channel is. And the kind of videos he makes sort of remind me of Christian YouTube, and I've talked before about how I feel about Christian YouTube. So Tom Holland is very much my speed. Now here Tom Holland has a conversation with a channel called Exploring the Quran and the Bible, which comes from a scholar who works at the University of Notre Dame. And again, a bunch of people are going to say, that's not fair. But, you know, before you said it's not fair that I start with a popular writer. Now you're going to say it's not fair that I start with a scholar because he's not Muslim, that I have to start with a Muslim scholar. Well, it may very well be at some point I start reading some Muslim scholars. That might happen, but remember everything I've said to this point. My main interest in this subject is to try to figure out what on earth we mean by a religion and how religions and civilization work together. Now, I'm going to jump in and play a little bit from this video. I thought it was an excellent conversation. I gained a lot by it. But one of the things that they're talking about, which is one of the things that you realize very quickly when you dabble into this subject, when you look at someone's story like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, that when you look at what's his face, Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie, and when you look at what happened to these editors of a particular French magazine that drew some pictures, that talking about Islam is something that a lot of people sort of stay away from because it's like, I don't need this in my life. And, if you're trying to promote Islam, it's a kind of a problem for you. It really is, especially in the West. And part of, again, my interest in this is because there are some factions of Christianity, even some factions of the Reformed Church, that they sort of get all hot and bothered like Muslims do. But the thing is, in the West, nobody's going to tolerate people going out there and killing each other over this. I mean, even after 9/11, in our system, there was a fair amount of effort to go around making sure that mosques weren't burned to the ground and Muslims weren't hunted on the street. Now, I'm sure there are incidences of violence against Muslims in America, and I would denounce that as quick as anybody else. And the fact that at the center of my religion is a man dying for his enemies, I don't think is immaterial to the question. But let's jump into this video and listen to a little bit about what they're talking about the way in which I think in many ways a lot of people, including in academia, sort of treat Islam with kid gloves. And here's the problem. And this is the same problem with all sorts of other social conversations that we have. To a degree, if women want to sort of dive into the arena where there are a lot of men and debate and do all of that, well, I'm not talking about physical violence here, but I'm saying if you're going to dive in, get ready for the kind of back and forth that is. And in the case of Islam, it means as Christianity has undergone for a couple of hundred years at least, a thoroughgoing, no-holds-barred, secular, materialist, atheist, unbelieving analysis of your origin story and, as Richard Dawkins says, your truth claims. It's all fair game. It's all on the table. So if you want to get into this, you can't really be too squeamish. Because if you, every time I do one of these things, I know it's going to find its way to the Broken Clock Tower Discord. It's just a cross I bear. It's a cross I gladly bear. So, yeah, and Christians that get all defensive and insecure and hot and bothered about atheists, and part of it's just okay. Yeah, we all have our tribalisms, but another part of it is, well, it's kind of where we're at. And if you really want to deal with the West and you want to be treated as adults and not as children, can't talk this way around them. We know how they get. As long as people are dealing with you that way, you will never be taken seriously. And your truth claims, your religion, the things you wish to promote, they'll never be taken seriously. So let's jump into it.
Obviously, I came to think about the Dome of the Rock, which similarly has that slight Archaeopteryx quality, it seemed to me, that the dome was...
Now, he was just talking about buildings in Ravenna, and again, I'm going through the Forge of Christendom, and just really enjoying it because he's talking about sort of the reawakening of empire in the West with Charlemagne. And of course, Rome is actually in Constantinople in the East, and they have their whole act together. And so, they send emissaries, and this is, of course, before the big breakup. So I'm really enjoying this history. And so, the emperor has a building in Ravenna, and it's like East meets West. But the East was so powerful and so wealthy and so ancient, and the West was so barbaric.
Of course, very Roman architectural feature that it has mosaics, that it's on a site that was politically, culturally, religiously sensitive in the Roman period, and to wondering, well, to what extent were the early years of the Arab Empire, um, did the Arab rulers of this empire have a similar relationship to Rome and to Persia as, I don't know, the Franks or
And again, for me, a lot of this, I had been my history degree, I had an American history. My theological church history was dominated by Latin Christianity. You just sort of go from the New Testament period to Augustine to the Reformation. I mean, that's generally what they sort of focused on. So I'm now, because of orthodoxy, friendship with Jonathan Peugeot, all of the stuff that I've learned. And then, okay, the Persian Empire and Tom Holland, the Persian Empire, the Romans in Constantinople, the Roman Empire there, that's what they call themselves. We call them Byzantine, but they call themselves Romans. And so all of this history is being opened up to me now.
or the Goths in the West had to Rome. And that was the question I wanted to ask myself. And it was probably a foolish project to have undertaken. Firstly, because I didn't really have the languages. I didn't have Arabic. And secondly, because, of course, I realized very rapidly that this was a question that opened up all kinds of very, very sensitive questions. And I found myself in.
And again, if you're someone living in the West and you're just watching what's happening in the world, and you're watching what's happening to Salman Rushdie and all of these people, it's like, do I need this hassle? Do I want to somehow have to sit down in a mosque with Muhammad hijab and have him, pull his little games? I've seen him on other things too, and I just think, not necessarily someone who knows how to behave themselves.
In the middle of what was effectively, I think in some ways, possibly the most stimulating academic debate in the whole field of historiography anywhere. Right. Certainly it was in the early 2010s when I embarked on it.
Yes.
And nobody had really written about it from a non-academic perspective for a non-academic audience. So the process.
Now, part of why I really like Tom Holland is my sense is he's got courage. I agree with C.S. Lewis. One of the things that we lack in the world, courage is not a virtue that you see often. And it isn't necessarily displayed in physical prowess, but Tom Holland at least says what he thinks. Now, he may be right or wrong about a bunch of things, but he has the guts to say it. And he's got the kind of cleverness to say it in a really interesting way, usually. And so he dares to write a popular history about the origins of Islam, something that's going on in the academic circles, but everybody's just sort of like, we've got these ideas, but don't. It's like parents, don't tell the children, don't tell the Muslims, they react so. And now we're going to get into that because all of this has everything to do with what I talk about Jesus infiltrating the world through secularity.
Process of deciding how to write it, there was a kind of two-layer thing. I had to decide what I thought, right. It's kind of absolutely immersive process of immersing myself in very, very dense, complicated literature, and then deciding how I was going to frame it for the general reader. So it was by miles the most challenging book I've written.
So the image you give of the Dome of the Rock and the larger question of the emergence of Islam with the backdrop of empire, both Byzantine, Roman, and Persian, or more generally the question of late antiquity and Islam's emergence. I mean, that is still the question for people who work on early Islam. It continues to be. There was a major book by a scholar named Aziz Al-Azmi entitled The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity. which takes a very distinctive anti-revisionist approach, quite rigorous book. I mean, it's not just apologetics, very, very serious academic book. In fact, people complain that its writing is too complicated to be understood by most people. But I mean that was prescient, that insight about thinking through Islam with a backdrop of empire and late antiquity. Yeah, it continues to be debated. Here at Notre Dame, I teach a seminar on Islamic origins. I have a visiting scholar now who's come from Turkey to study the Quran in late antiquity, sitting in the seminar. And this is sort of an issue which transcends Western scholarship. Increasingly in Islamic countries, there's interest in this. I did want to ask.
Because it was the Quran that obviously I came to realize stood at the heart of the question, because I am not a Muslim, so I don't think it came from God. So therefore, if I'm writing, and I think that this is,
and even now he's not going to touch on it, but obviously for me, who deals with in some ways analogous issues, me being a crunchy Christian who believes in things, me being a confessional Christian who subscribes to things. Christians in the West have been dealing with these issues for a very long time. And so, but of course, I feel free to be highly skeptical about the Quran. Comes from God. Well, what do you mean by that? And so it's interesting because in another video that I'll play, probably not the section that I'll play, the word hermeneutics gets put in there, and some in the panel don't have any idea what that word means, and it's the Muslim scholar who has a very interesting take in this, so when we get to the next video where most of the panelists are Muslim, I found that completely fascinating, because what I saw is in many ways that the history of the West is provoking within Islam many of the issues that it provoked within Christianity, along the lines of basically the modernist fundamentalist debate that occurred in Western Christianity.
Is a discipline that a popular writer perhaps has to, because I am not a Muslim, so I don't think it came from God. So therefore, if I'm writing, and I think that this is a discipline that a popular writer perhaps has to face up to more rigorously than an academic writer. I've read loads and loads of academic accounts, studies of early Islam that do not overtly grapple with the horns of this particular bull. If you do not think the Quran comes from,
right, and that's the problem. Oh, you Muslims, just keep believing what we want. We know how problematic you all are. We know. I mean, I think about Sarah Hyder's comment. It's an infantilization of a whole community. Now, we're not going to tell you what we really think, because we know you really can't control yourselves.
God, then you do not overtly grapple with the horns of this particular bull. If you do not think the Quran comes from God, then you have to explain where it comes from, and that requires you providing an alternative explanation. And I think that it's a text of human origin, and therefore you have to say, well, what might the human origins have been?
Most people,
and obviously it's
incredibly
incredibly difficult, because the only account we have of how the Quran comes into being is the Muslim one.
Is the religious.
So
right.
You're kind of groping around in a dark room.
Well, most people, they simply will attribute agency to the Quran itself. The Quran says this, the Quran says that, or maybe speak obtusely about the Quran's author says this or that. I mean,
yes, but what do they mean by that? It's very, and the thing is, I think that if you are a scholar talking to scholars, everyone is so familiar with the context that perhaps that is all read. But if you are writing for a general audience who know nothing about it, and you're saying, actually, the Quran didn't come from an angel, didn't come from God, your reader is going to want you to explain, well, okay, where did it come from then?
Right. Well, I've noted that scholars who enter into Quranic studies or early Islamic studies from other fields oftentimes remark that this field looks different. Islamic studies looks different. People speak in different ways. They're more careful. They don't ask the same questions. For example, I don't want to, as my kids would say, throw shade on this particular book because it's very useful, but the Study Quran, published by HarperCollins, is more or less a constructive theological project. Extremely useful, has lots of resources. It's a compendium of Islamic commentary, but it doesn't look like the Study Bible, also published by HarperCollins, at all. I don't know if that resonates with you, that you sort of
Very much so.
And again, someone who is a believing Christian, who at least all the books over there, they're all biblical commentaries. Some are modernist, critical. Others are conservative, reformed. Got all of the IVP, ancient critical commentary, with all of the church father comments on, so I'm immersed with this. And so if you say, no, we're just not going to talk about that with respect to this, it's like, okay, I don't just have conservative reformed commentaries here. I want to read what the modernists say because that's part of this civilization. And if you can't grapple with that, you're not really going to grapple with the civilization. You're going to be a hothouse tomato.
A different
Very much so.
Different conversation. But it doesn't look like the Study Bible, also published by HarperCollins, at all. I don't know if that resonates with you, that you sort of
very much so.
Into a different
very much so.
Different conversation.
Yeah, very much so, because I wasn't immersed in biblical scholarship, but I knew enough about it to know that there'd been a kind of almost 2-century process of scholars crawling over the biblical text, like gnawing away at it. Devouring any sense of it being a whole, and systematically saying, well, where did this come? When was it written? How was it written? What might the authors have been? What's the history of its transmission? When was it canonized? All these kind of questions. And none of this seemed to really be a feature of the study of the Quran. And one of the reasons why I found Patricia Crone, who you mentioned, so helpful, was that she did seem to be asking these questions and in some way providing answers, as did Fred Donner as well, who was also in the film.
Yes.
So he, I think it's the collection of essays that you edited on the Quran in late antiquity, and he opens with a brilliant essay where he says that some of the most fundamental questions that every other person who writes about an ancient text takes for granted, we have no answer to them. Who wrote it? Where was it written? When was it canonized? Even what language was it written in? That these remain subjects of furious debate. So it was, as an outsider and a non-specialist, it was a very, very grueling project to attempt.
I would also add just a quick coda maybe to this conversation, and then I have one more question about the project on Islam. But there is a very intriguing trend in early Islamic studies, Quranic studies, where increasingly a younger generation of scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, but above all Muslim. I mean, most younger scholars in the West in this field are Muslims, some religious, some not religious, but at least coming from a Muslim context. They are engaging more and more with late antiquity and biblical tradition. Obviously, when it comes to thinking about the Quran, it's not just the Bible, it's all the Jewish and Christian texts. And I would very humbly add that exploring the Quran and the Bible is a good example of that sort of work. So there's lots of younger scholars. So I'm slightly.
But you see, you hadn't written that when I when I did mine. I wish you had.
Yes. So
again, so it's like, oh, this is opening up. Well, of course it's opening up, because at some point you're going to have to ask the civilizational question. Are you in a part of the world where you can open it up? And that, well, American University, South Bend, Indiana, sounds pretty safe. Tom Holland in a little bit more, a little bit tougher neighborhood with respect to this. Now, in the comments section, one of you sent me to this video. Does Islam need a reformation? And before I play some of this video, I have a certain way that I'm going to treat this video. But I first want to treat the question. And I completely understand the objections to the question by many Muslims. And it's actually talked about in this video as well. Because how would it be my place to tell another religion to reform itself? Fair enough. And so I don't really care for the whole need a reformation type thing. And in fact, that's dealt with in this video, because the context of what happens in the Protestant Reformation are wholly different from what's going on here. The real questions are, how will Islam be impacted as it goes out into the West? What will happen to Muslims as they are in the West? Now, again, today, I'm recording this on Friday, and I did a live stream today, and there was one mention of Islam that, well, their populations are going, and so in some ways, part of what's happening in terms of who will inherit the earth is the question, well, who will outproduce whom? So for a while, the conversation in Israel and Palestine was, well, the Israelis are in real trouble because the Palestinians are reproducing like crazy. Well, now there's a whole new group of immigrants in Israel who are reproducing like crazy, and so the battle is engaged. But it's also the case that not everyone who is born into a particular tradition completely embodies what their parents do. And now you can see some of my interest in, let's say, Malcolm and Simone, because that's very direct in terms of their project. And a big part of this is the way in which religions change, even when religious conservatives change, even if the conservatives themselves don't notice it. This is something that you can see very clearly among, for example, conservative Christians in America. In the modernist fundamentalist fight, the fundamentalists became basically alternate modernists. And this is more and more sort of being exposed as we continue to look at some other areas. During the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther did reform the Roman Catholic Church through the Council of Trent. You get into René Girard and his ideas about mimetic rivalry. If you engage in mimetic rivalry with your adversary, if you're Muslim and you come to the West and you just keep battling in order to try to stay Muslim, odds are in the process you will become increasingly secular in ways that you pay no attention. You can wear the headgear, you can say all the words, you can do all the things, but there are layers within you that, well, you're basically absorbed and being absorbed. You're absorbing and being absorbed. And I think in some ways the easiest place to see this is in the concluding statements of the debate. Maybe we'll play the concluding remarks and then we'll play the introductory remarks, because what was fascinating to me is that many of it's very clear who's on one side of the table and who's on the other side of the table in terms of this debate. But what you find are sort of historic postures towards an attempt of a community of beliefs under assault and the strategy they are using to maintain themselves against a superior foe. You can see this in patterns found, for example, in first century Judea, where you've got Sadducees, you've got Zealots, you've got Essenes, you've got Pharisees, all these different strategies. There's a limited number of things on the menu with respect to dealing with a cultural adversary who is basically assimilating your people by virtue of cultural strength. So let's start with, well, maybe we should start with the introductions. Now, one of the most interesting things about this video, how it starts, is that the moderator on the panel, I don't know who she is. But boy, does she lay down the law. She's basically like, any deviation from these rules, you are out of this room. Now, we have security on hand. We will pull your butt out of this room. Well, why do you start with something like that? I don't start worship services with that. It's because she completely understands, given the topic, given the people in the room, that the likelihood of bad behavior is quite high, and she's not having it, so she's trying to keep the place under control. Okay, so what she does is she does introductions to them. She doesn't let them say them. It's been a couple days since I watched this. So let's go through the introduction so at least you have a sense of who's at the table.
The translator for Penguin Classics of Herodotus' Histories, and about to do a Penguin Classic on one of the first ever English royal, right? There we go.
First King of England.
I should say that, in fact, this video is about 6 years old.
Very exciting. We look forward to that. His most recent book, Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the House of Caesar, was published last September in 2015. His previous book, In the Shadow of the Sword, covered late antiquity and the emergence of Islam. Meanwhile, Islam, The Untold Story, was his award-winning documentary, questioning received Muslim traditions about the life of Prophet Muhammad. Please welcome Tom Holland.
Not a hearty welcome. So again, courage.
To my right, welcome Zara Huda Faris. Zara is a speaker and researcher at the Muslim Debate Initiative. Zara Faris is a graduate of Arabic and Islamic Studies from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. She has delivered lectures at a number of universities around the world, including King's College London and University College London. She has publicly debated Green Party leader Natalie Bennett. And Zara speaks on a plethora of topics, including women in Islam, justice for women and men, Reformation and revival, Muslims in the West, and more. She most recently sat on the motion, "This House believes Sharia law is fairer than English law." Please welcome Zara Faris. To my left again, Theo Hobson is a journalist and theologian. Theo Hobson is an Anglican theologian. He was educated at St. Paul's School in London. He read English literature at the University of York, then theology at the University of Cambridge, where he was a member of Hughes Hall. Theo has written on Protestant thought, especially its relationship with secular liberalism, and currently writes a blog on The Spectator. Welcome, please, Theo Hobson. To my right, Abdullah Al-Andalusi, debater, thinker, and co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. Abdullah Al-Andalusi is an international speaker, thinker, and Muslim activist. His work involves explaining and demonstrating, by rational argument, the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system, and promoting the Islamic way of life and solutions for contemporary problems. Abdullah has also spoken at numerous universities, colleges, and regularly appears on various TV channels, including BBC and Al Jazeera. In 2009, Abdullah co-founded the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative. Please welcome Abdullah.
Recognize anyone?
Next to Abdullah on my right is Safruk Chowdhury. He's a theologian and academic. Safruk Chowdhury completed his undergraduate studies in philosophy in 2002, focusing on medieval philosophical theology at King's College London, before embarking on further studies in Arabic and traditional Islamic sciences at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. He returned to London to complete his master's degree in Islamic Studies with distinction. Safruk has taught philosophy and Islamic studies at both undergraduate and postgraduate level. He is an independent writer and teacher in critical thinking, history, and religious studies. Please welcome Safruk.
Okay, so I'm listening to. I mean, these are obviously, you've got academics, you've got Muslims, you've got people. They're going to be across the spectrum. But again, what I'm interested in and what I'm watching for is how immersion in the West changes often things below the waterline. Oh, we need rational arguments for this. Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. That, of course, is mapped onto our world, too.
I'm actually going to stop questions there in order that we get 30 seconds. It doesn't make any sense, Stephen, leaving my mouth saying 30 seconds. But can you please just give us a tiny summary of your standpoint now at the end to do with British values and Muslims fitting in and Islam being a system that works in the West? And I will begin with Saf.
So what did you want? Do you want to answer all those points in 30 seconds?
Do you want to summarise where you are now?
Well,
and give us a parting thought, really, a parting thought.
I think, in terms of British Islam, we need to be very, very cautious. Perhaps the cautionary position would be to take a disassociative stance from the idea of British being attached to Islam, especially because it's vague, but more so because it's couched in ideational, axiological terms, i.e. to do with concepts and values. In other words, British Islam, as I see it, is a way of Muslims being Muslims in this country, not determined from their own references and their own sources, but top-down from politicians. So I think a disassociative stance from British Islam, I know some people appropriate it in a meaningful way, but I think looking at it in a more nuanced way, it's something that's been, hatched by politicians and incubated in down the street. But just on the point of reformation, there's lots of things I think we didn't get a chance to unpack. But especially concepts like tajdeed and renewal, ideas like islah, which is not reformation actually, which is translated as reformation, but it's not. But it's bringing something back to its original pristine and sound state. That would have been good.
Okay, so he didn't say a lot, except that, we don't really want the political environment defining our religion. Fair enough. But what we want is, we want to go back to, now someone obviously who's Protestant understands this impulse, or someone who's Orthodox, or someone who's Catholic. They're all trying to go back to a pristine version of our religion. Okay, well, fair enough. Well, what is that? And you always have the problem that, well, okay, so you want to go back to, 6th, 7th, 8th century Islam? You're not living in the 8th century anymore. All of those issues remain.
Good to unpack, because that would have been a good parameter in which to have the discussion.
Okay, and thank you for that parting thought. Parting thought, Theo?
I think I'd say that this sort of discussion is a sign of the reformation of Islam. I think people here, it's happening. Just the fact of us discussing, taking for granted human rights, the rights of women, and so on, it's happening in these very discussions.
Okay, so now he reveals his cards. Well, I'm about human rights. And actually within the debate, Tom Holland a few times points out, that all comes out of something here. And let's keep going.
It's difficult, it's awkward, there's a tension between the tradition and now, but the fact that we're having this discussion, that's my parting shot. It's a good sign.
Thank you, Theo. And Sarah?
I'll be honest, I'm not really interested in a British version of Islam, because Islam naturally, in all the ways that it doesn't really theologically matter, adapts to whichever culture it is in, with the theology generally remaining the same. And I'm particularly...
Her summary is one of the most interesting, because here's someone who's got all these degrees, and she basically says, well, no, what's so funny is that it's this interesting mix of, let's say, feminist studies and Islamic studies. It's fascinating.
Clearly not interested in in all the ways that it doesn't really theologically matter, adapts to whichever culture it is in, with the theology generally remaining the same. And I'm particularly not interested in being force-fed any set of values, be they British values, American values, that I don't have a say in what those values actually.
Expressive individualism, right there, right in the middle. You know, she's in that sense. I want to go back to pure Islam because it's the same in every culture, and I don't want anybody feeding me anything. It's like, you've already been deeply impacted by expressive individualism. It's already in you. And so you just sort of twist and turn, and there you go. Expressive individualist Islam.
Actually mean. I'm just expected to sort of accept what someone else is telling me what they mean. With regards to Reformation itself, I just want to have, leave a very simple message, and I think it was mentioned very early on in the discussion, and that is in the Muslim world, it's in need of revival. It's not in need of reformation. The Muslim world is an example of what happens when you try to change Islam and mix it with secular liberal values. Pakistan, for example, if you want to see whether it's a good idea to reform it in that way, just look to the Muslim world today. The Muslim world needs to revert to its classical understanding.
Part of what's interesting about the Muslim world is, of course, Islam seems to fully embrace its civilizational aspect. But, okay, you've got Iran. And what's interesting is during this whole debate, ISIS, this new caliphate in the middle of the Syrian civil war, that's what couches this whole thing. Because it's like, well, what is Islam? Well, here they are. They're trying to refound the caliphate. And no, that's not the caliphate. Yes. And you got to hand it to at least the atheists when they look around and say, yeah, you religious people, you say it's all one religion, but you can't get on the same page. Yeah, fair enough. And especially if it's a strongly civilizational religion. In fact, if you look around, well, you've got the Kingdom of Jordan. You've sort of got a strongman government in Egypt. You had a strongman government in Iraq. What's there now? I don't know. You've got the Taliban in Afghanistan. You've got Pakistan and Iran right now, sort of trading volleys. Indonesia seems to be the most coherent. In terms of, well, they're not in a war with anyone. But there's so many layers to this because, of course, Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch. So you've got some of that Dutchness. And well, what was that Dutchness that came over? Well, that was, the Reformed that was over there in the Netherlands and their history of tolerance. And so there's just so many layers. And so in that sense, it's really easy to sort of throw up your hands and say, religions don't make a difference. No, they do. And then with all of the complexity, figuring out, okay, how? Somebody in a previous video left a great comment with something that I've thought about often and saying, you guys debate this, but you don't pay attention to, let's say, Spanish colonizing culture. Spanish Christianity that colonized Latin America and had its own history there, something that I know at least something about. That's very different from English colonial history. It's very different from Russian and Eastern Orthodox history because sort of it moves from sort of Constantinople to Moscow. And of course, now that's all. So this is such a complex thing, which makes it interesting to me. But, so here's this woman, and she's an expressive individualist, also sort of a radical Islamist that's basically, no, you don't understand. It was the golden age. The golden age for women is true Islam. And it's kind of like, boy, it's so funny. That's, trad Catholics and so in other words, you see her as part of this other movement that is basically a deep critique of the way the contemporary world deals with women and sort of inverts it and says, no, we're happy in these traditional roles. This is where we want to be. And it's like, yeah, hear plenty of that in the English, in the Christian context too, in its various forms. So again, all of these waves are going through.
And Muslims who are not in the Muslim world, as individuals, as all members of society, need to consciously be, aware of what they're doing and just
as individuals. So you've got individualism, you've got expressive, they're all in her, but she's added another distinct aspect to it.
Generally, reformed themselves, but it's nothing to do with their religion.
Dr. Parting thought.
Yeah, I think it's important that we become self-critical and introspective. And I think I'm for a British Islam, not the MI5 variety. And I'm thinking about Islam that is Quran-centric, not paying the lip service or heeding the hadith, the Sharia.
He was fascinating. He's a Sadducee. He's a first century Judean Sadducee. He says, only the Quran. These other books, leave them to the side. And an English Islam is what we need. That's only based on the Quran. And it's like, because you study biblical studies, you learn about the Sadducees, just the Torah, and sort of push the others away, and they also tend to be lined up with the aristocracy. And so you say, well, that's one of the interesting perennial things on the menu in terms of how to deal with a much more dominant culture.
And the fatwa, all man-made stuff. And I expect this British Islam to be gender equal. I expect it to be non-sectarian. I expect it to be intercultural, not multicultural. And I expect it to be independent. We need to cut the umbilical cord that ties us to Saudi Arabia, to the Wahhabis, the Salafis, and all the other extremists there. We want Islam that's open, that's liberal, that's inclusive, that's pluralistic, that belongs here and now.
Thank you very much.
I watched him and I was just fascinated. I thought, yeah, this is complex.
Tom?
I think that we live through the past 50 years through an incredibly interesting period of British history. On the one hand, we have gone through an ethical and moral revolution of a speed and totality, I think, without precedent in our history. You just have to look at the transformation in attitudes, say, to homosexuality to illustrate that. Simultaneously with that, there has been a recrudescence of debate and interest in religion that I think is sort of almost unprecedented since the 1650s. So, and
what he's doing here, I mean, you can see this at the end of his book, Dominion, and you can hear it in his podcast every now, and I can't wait for him to write the book on this topic, because this is the one he says, this is the one I really want to make, because in some ways, the 1960s is like the 1650s or 60s, or at least the 15th century, because you have this. There is in a sense a reformation going on. The counterculture was this massive religious movement, and you think Islam is going to come out of this unscathed, at least to the people who are in the West. Again, some people I've talked about Remy, and here you've got an Islamic kid living in New Jersey. He's having sex with girls. He's doing pornography, and he's now, is that true to life? I have no idea. I am not an Islamic teenager growing up in northern New Jersey. I did grow up in northern New Jersey, but northern New Jersey, 40 years ago. But the issues are there. And so when we get to, talk to Malcolm and Simone and the urban monoculture, how is that going to impact Islamic youth? Now, I think many people think, well, they'll just sort of be homogenized and washed up and washed through with atheism and agnosticism, but that's not what's happening to Christians. See, the urban monoculture doesn't just sort of make people into one thing. It deeply impacts just about everything. But what you see, again, look at Clay Rutledge. No, human beings remain human beings. Well, let's finish this up and then we'll go to something else.
This imposes a particular burden, I think, on the Muslims of Britain, and I will finish with two quotations. One, a hadith: every innovation is heresy, every heresy is error, and every error leads to hell. The next one is from Al-Ghazali: strange as it may seem, accepted practices of today are the taboos of a day gone by, and the taboos of today are the accepted practices of a day yet to come.
Thank you very much, Tom. And Abdullah.
I don't believe Islam changes depending on where you are on the earth's crust. And I think that truth doesn't change either, depending on which part of...
One of the points that Tom Holland keeps making is this universalizing. I was just talking about the Alex O'Connor, Richard Dawkins conversation. And one of the big points that Richard Dawkins makes in the science is universal. Well, he's making a universalizing thing. Well, Christianity very much is a universalizing religion. Islam comes after it, picks up that universalizing tendency. Science comes after it, picks up that universalizing tendency. Well, okay, well, how then the universal and the particular? And so now you're going to be a certain kind of fundamentalist.
Of the world you're in. I would say that there's a fundamental mistake here. The majority sect of Christianity never actually reformed Catholicism. They successfully resisted it, and they still rail against secular liberalism to this day, our Catholic brothers. So they would probably join us on this panel and argue similar things in some ways.
Yeah, because the Catholic Church is monolithic, just like Islam.
I would say that if you're going to ask to reform Islam, you need to ask what you want to reform it to. And the reason why we mentioned secular liberalism today is if you just look at secular liberalism, the wealth inequality that creates 62 people on this planet controlling 40 or 50% of the wealth of this world, according to an Oxfam report, is quite shocking, as well as the
Yeah, because, Islam is just a brotherhood of communist income equality, right? Saudi Arabia?
Simultaneous epidemics of obesity and famines happening at the same time. These are issues that I think Islam should be addressing, including climate change, I might add, that also has been affected by capitalism.
This is just fascinating.
Overproduction. But what I would just finish off by saying is that laws aren't actually linked to progress. So China, not a secular liberal country, but look, it's now catching up with the US, might surpass it. The West had 600 years of progress without secular liberalism, and Islam could do the same. My final parting shot would be that the Muslim world does have a problem, a very big problem. But the problem is that Muslims need to be reformed, but Islam only needs to be revived. And that's it.
Just fascinating. Okay, let's listen to a little bit more of it.
Dying for a higher plane or something like that, or a higher ideal, that's dangerous. Another sort of theological idea that's come under attack, and I'm sure other theological precepts will be brought out in the discussion and the debate tonight. Another one is the fact that the Quran, the text of the Quran is taken as the absolute literal word of God, whereas that's dangerous because that locks us into absolutes, that makes it an immovable text, things like that. So for some people, yeah, I mean
So he's not agreeing with that. He's basically countering it, and saying, well, he's dealing with new atheism basically.
These ideas, if they should be reformed. Excuse me, these ideas should be reformed. However, I think there is a strong case for the driver or the clamour for reforming Islam being political. So some reasons could be, political reasons could be the fact that in Europe, for example, there is a strong visibility of Islam. There's a growth of Islam in the public space. So you've got Islamic services, Islamic products. You've got this idea of creeping Sharia that the media, the tabloids like to use. You've got Islamic symbols, so the headscarf, the veil in some cases, minarets. So what we're starting to see more and more an encroachment of Islam into the public space. So that could be a possible reason because that's an indicator, that's a marker that really secularism isn't something Muslims have wholeheartedly embraced, because the pre-modern understanding of Islam anyway is that Islam is totalizing. In other words, Islam regulates every aspect of life. So that could be one possible reason. Another possible reason could be the demographic explosion. You know, Muslim growth rate is very, very, very high. And so what was once a small problematic minority is now going to become a large problematic minority, if I can say that, if I can put it like that. So the Muslim percentage is growing. The failure of integration policy or assimilation models. So in Europe, there is it is clear that governments are struggling to co-opt Muslims into adopting secular values. Muslims have been sort of putting it at arm's length. They've not embraced it. They've not been convinced of embracing a secular ideal.
So just to
these are just three.
Summarize that.
So just to summarize, some people look at it as theology, but primarily I think it's more political. The driver for reforming Islam has been political. Some of the reasons I mentioned.
Thank you. Tom, can I bring you in here? Some of what we were hearing there from Safruk, an encroachment of Islam on public space threatens secularism of Europe. Does that mean Islam has to change, Europe has to change? Is there a happy medium?
Well, I think lurking in the question is the implicit sense that actually European Islam has already changed, because another way of phrasing that division between theology and politics would be to say church and state. Now, I understand why you didn't say church or state, because obviously the concept is a Christian one. But I think the fact that you see this division now as existing is interesting for the way in which it suggests that Christian concepts are starting to seep into the intellectual fabric of European Islam. Now, that division of church and state within Christendom reaches a long way back. I mean, it has its origins ultimately in the response of Jesus to the question when he got given the coin, should we pay tribute to Caesar? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. And that kind of enshrined a notion that the political and the spiritual should be distinct, which has fed into modern day secularism. If you like, secularism is a Christian invention that has been secularized. And I think the implication of your question is that the same process is now starting to happen to Islam, that Muslims are starting, in Europe certainly, are starting to internalize this notion that there is indeed a division between the sacral and the secular. And the fact that you frame it in that way, I think, sort of serves to answer your question. I think that we can see that actually. Can you just what specifically was the question? The actual phrasing.
The debate being really about theology, or was it a political debate in regards to Islam and reformation?
In which case, it's about both. And we have two different categories there, and that is extremely interesting.
Why do you see Muslims as internalizing this division between mosque and state, if we want to put it in that way? What do you see the markers as being Muslims internalizing it or conceptualizing it in that way?
I'm going to hold you there because I actually want to bring in Abdullah on this, and we'll come back to you in a second. Abdullah, this idea of church and state seeping into the Muslim community here in Europe, is that something you recognise?
I think the problem in the West is it demands all its minorities to assimilate into the state ideology, and it has always done so for other minorities, Jews and Catholics prior to that, and we're just the latest minority of which we have a belief system which has something to say about the political realm, or in essence, man's affairs or life's affairs. We believe that your purpose in life has a connection to life's affairs, a very radical idea. But that was actually the idea of every civilization up until the Western civilization realized they had a problem with trying to reconcile issues with their religion. What I would disagree with Tom Holland was, or maybe on a point of text, is that when Jesus was asked, according to the New Testament anyway, should we pay taxes to Rome? And Jesus says, why are you trying to trap me? Because he knows that any way he answers, and generally the Jews at the time didn't like paying taxes to Rome. Rome was occupying Judea. And so Jesus had a very clever answer, which is, give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give unto God what belongs to God. But what belongs to God? What, the heavens and the earth? All right? That was Jesus' argument, and people were amazed at the argument, and they couldn't fault him. He could have just said, yeah, pay taxes. Why didn't you just say that? Why don't you just be more direct then, if that's what he meant, right? But what we find is later on, an individual called St. Paul, who I would say is the first reformist of Christianity, did away with the Mosaic law. And the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, was a complete way of life. It was a political, it gave political laws, it gave a system of ruling. And St. Paul did away with that, made Christianity more acceptable to Gentiles, to Greeks, to Romans. And when in Rome, do as the Romans. This is probably St. Paul's philosophy. And that created the problem within Christianity, because St. Paul never envisioned Christians getting power. They believed that Jesus was going to come in their lifetime. So who needs to care about power? When Jesus comes, he will be the one in power.
Now, an amazing thing about watching him do Christian theology is that this idea of the shaping of the New Testament in terms of the imminent return of Christ, if you go back and you watch N.T. Wright's Gifford lectures, N.T. Wright runs that down and says, what's it, the 17th, 18th century where this begins? Again, you just watch. It's almost impossible for any of these people to frame this stuff. This is what's so potent about Tom Holland's argument. Once you understand Tom Holland's argument and you watch this entire debate, you watch people challenging him, and the framing of their challenge of him continues to strengthen his point.
And he'll set everything right. But Jesus didn't turn up in their lifetime. And a couple hundred years later, Christians ended up in power, and they didn't know what to do when they got into power. And that kind of led to the kind of problems and also the rise of the Roman Catholic Church and so on and so forth. So anyway, before I go off the topic, what I would just say is that the question isn't really, do Muslims have to change Islam, or should we reform Islam to fit into the West? The real question, which was asked by scholar Tim Winter on the matter, was, can Western liberalism tolerate Islam? And I think that's a better question to ask.
That's a great one that we'll be coming back to in a second. Thea, I'm going to let you have a question asked, and then you can bring in some of your thoughts on that, because this question is for you.
I want to answer that question.
Go on then. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're getting to some pretty heavy stuff here, which is my sort of area, which is great. Yeah, I agree that Christianity begins with this separation of church and state, basically, whether you say it's through Jesus, or I agree it's largely through Paul, actually, where he says that the Christian community accepts living within a non-Christian political order, which is the Roman Empire. And they're not even planning to take over the Roman Empire and Christianize it, at least in the New Testament period. They're assuming that their religion is non-political. And now that's a complete difference, as you all know, from the origins of Islam, where the two things come together, where the prophet is, in a sense, launching a new political order.
Does the New Testament not imagine that the God of Israel wins? You're going to have to deal with the book of Revelation.
One historian says he's his own Constantine, who's the Roman emperor later on. So in a sense, it's true that when Christianity does start having power, it doesn't know what to do with it, although it does have a few hundred years to sort of get used to the idea. It doesn't suddenly panic and go, hey, help, we're having power now. But that's quite a good way of setting up the difference, is that Christianity is not a religion which assumes that religion and politics are a unity. And you can call that by different reasons. Later on, it's called Christendom. or a slightly contentious term, theocracy, the unity of religion and politics. Christianity is uniquely skeptical about that, and that's its big difference from Islam.
I think I just want to...
He sort of gives the standard answer. And again, I mean, we've dealt with this a lot. And when I say religion is dollars and politics is cents, you're not going to really separate them. Now, church and state, you're separating institutions, but...
To bring in here the machinations of the Catholic Church and the politics of the bishopric.
Yeah. Well, in practice, of course, Christianity does become an empire and have power. So in a sense, it does resemble Islam or any other form of empire or whatever, where it's a Christian power and it was the most powerful in the world. But the difference is that when you look at its founding texts, there isn't a basis for that unity of religion and politics. That's the big difference. Although in practice, it does become a political power.
Could I just...
go ahead.
I mean, I think it's distinctively Western, actually. It's a Latin notion. And this idea that church and states should be separate, actually, you don't get it, for instance, in Byzantium to nearly the same degree. It really gets enshrined in European history in the...
And hence his book, The Forge of Christendom, because he sees that in Byzantium, and this is part of where the Orthodox coming into the conversation in the United States, we're having this conversation about Christian nationalism. This is where this gets interesting, because Rome and Constantinople, it goes differently.
11th century, with a remarkable pope called Gregory VII, who absorbs within the Catholic Church the sacral right that emperors and kings within Christendom had traditionally laid claim to. And by doing that, he effectively desacralized the realm of the king, the realm of what would become known as the secular. And so the corollary of that ultimately was that by absorbing the sacral into itself, the Catholic Church created a space which people, both within and outside the church, were able to accept existed beyond the sacral level. And it's it's that ultimately feeds into European Western modernity, because you have this concept of church and state as being separate entities. But the irony of it is that the godfather of that separation is actually a pope.
Okay, let's have the next question, which...
Then they basically get into the argument, and what was interesting is that this gets into a little bit about, the emperor. The emperor, there can be religious pluralism under the emperor. And then, of course, her argument, if you understand sort of where she's coming from, she says, well, we already had this, because Christians and Jews were happy under Islamic rulers. Now, you go back to the other video, we'll talk about the famine and basically how Islam arose. They were the mercenaries. Tom Holland talks about that. But here you have this debate about, well, wait a minute, what really was that like?
Defense. So, just because someone uses the language of religion doesn't mean that they are representing the religion, or that somehow their religion is now requiring a reformation. I just wanted to make something.
Okay, I don't want us to evade this question that Theo is, which is the point of us being here tonight. What is reformation? What does it need? Do the people in this room who are Muslims need to change in order to be in a secular Western environment? Tom, I'll come to you next, Doctor.
Well, I actually think that the influence of the West has been on Islam has been much greater even than Abdullah implied, because I think that it's had a corrosive effect on the autonomy of Islamic thought, which really, until I suppose the early 19th century, had existed without influence from the West. Christianity, Western Christianity and Islam were not greatly interested in each other, and did not greatly come into ideological contact with each other until the 19th century. And then you mentioned the right of Jews and Christians to live under Islamic rule. But of course, as you will know, it was prescribed in the Quran that Jews and Muslims pay for the privilege, and that they be subject to discriminatory taxation. And as it evolved over the course of Islamic history, it was agreed that Jews and Christians...
Now, it struck me when Jonathan Peugeot talks about leaving the mosque in London, people are coming, you don't understand what it's like living here. It's like, well, do you pay a special Muslim tax to live here? That wouldn't be tolerated. Because why? Well, because of Christian ideas about separation of church and state and religious freedom.
Christians should feel humiliated when they paid the tax. Now, that tax, the jizya, was removed, licensed out, together with slavery, over the course of the 19th and 20th century, not primarily because this was a movement welling up from within the ideological marrow of Islam, but under the influence of essentially French revolutionary thoughts. And the very idea, the very phrase, universal human rights, implies that there exists out there something like natural law. It's out there, it's universal, it's there. It justifies the fact that everyone should be treated in the same way. Now, traditionally, the justification for law in the Muslim tradition is that it comes from God. So essentially,
is that not a natural law?
No. Because in the Western tradition, which ultimately derives from Greek philosophy, is this idea that law exists out there beyond the gods.
The meta-divine realm.
Independent law of the gods. Okay, there is a hand at the back. There was
the whole video is fascinating. And again, as I said, you find all of these elements in it, but I continue to be persuaded that even Islamic fundamentalists living in the West, not unlike Christian fundamentalists living in the West, find themselves deeply impacted by many of the deep assumptions and ideas that have, in a sense, won even quiet culture wars and bubbled up through the top. And you can sort of put your fundamentalism on top of it, but you've absorbed so many of the assumptions. And part of what is interesting with Islam, unlike the West, is that, well, these Westerners are basically natives of these countries, and those coming from another part of the world do not have the same assumptions. And so right away, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so you have these cultural conflicts. So anyway, I wanted to put some of this material in front of you, and I'll probably continue to chew. And again, back to what I said at the beginning, and it was funny because the comment that I had made on the video about going to church, my son said, yeah, I was reading in the Discord, and how many disclaimers did you give in that video? And still at the end of the video, people were saying, what's Paul Vanderklay saying? You can go any place? It's like, so in that sense, maybe I'm wasting my breath. My interest in this is what's fascinating about looking at this in Islam, where you would say, wow, these people are living in their own probably ghettoized communities. They're living with their own subculture. They're living with their own institutions. They're living with their religious institutions. They have so many other buffers sort of keeping them from just absorbing. We can adopt Grim Grizz's talk, set, and the values that come in. And what happens are these values just come in deep from below. And even when you have a fundamentalist like Zara here, it's like, well, Islam can be in any culture. You just listen to it and you just think, it's a little naive. That's a little naive. And that the interplay of these things is far more complex. So that's my interest in this conversation. Like I said, I have zero attraction to becoming Muslim. Sorry, if you're holding out hope out there, and you got the whole. So you're saying there's a chance. Now I am not saying there is any chance. And okay, no problem. But I'm fascinated by the cultural dynamics, especially because of some of the ways that it's alike and dissimilar. And I tend to find Tom Holland's thesis very compelling. So, yeah, there won't be any comments for this video. Nobody will have an opinion about this. So, well, just maybe do me a favor and leave one.